Hi everyone. So we want to talk about the last of the four Gospels in the New Testament, which is the Gospel of John. And as we've mentioned a few times in class, the Gospel of John is a bit unique in relation to the other three Gospels. John includes um, stories, teaching, discourses, sayings that the other three Gospels don't include. Even though there's not a slide on your PowerPoint for this, uh, you probably want to know that the Gospel of John was written quite a bit later than the other three Gospels, probably around the late 80s AD, maybe even 90 AD. So we're talking for the Gospel of John, really 50 or so years after Christ's death. And that's a long time to be able to reflect on what happened with the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And so, as we look through the Gospel of John, and as you read through it, you're going to find quite a bit of material that's different from what you may have read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It doesn't mean it's contrary, it just means it's different. So one of the really key ways that John differs from the other three Gospels are in some of the ways, the key themes that he uses. First of all, John uses a lot of Old Testament allusions. That OT means Old Testament, not overtime. John uses a lot of Old Testament allusions that we don't see really in the other three Gospels. So, for instance, John has Jesus talking about the fact that he is the manna from heaven, he is the bread of life. John tells of Jesus comparing himself to the serpent that's lifted up in the wilderness. In the book of Numbers, Israel rebels against God, and as an act of judgment, God sends these fiery serpents to persecute, to hurt and harm and kill the people of Israel. And the way that an Israelite could be saved in that situation was by looking at a serpent that Moses lifted up on a stick, so that they had to look up at this serpent on the stick. And so it's this sort of in other words, they had to look up to something hanging on a piece of wood, and that something was the sign or the means of God's judgment. And that's how the Israelites were saved in that situation. Well, the same thing with Jesus. Jesus says that they need to look at the Son of Man lifted up on the cross, basically, so that now, again, there's this piece of wood, the cross, that you have to look up at, and what's hanging on it is Jesus' body, which has taken on the judgment and wrath of God. So that's another allusion that John uses from the Old Testament. You see here in letters C and D and also letter F for the temple, John uses what's called a replacement motif or a replacement theme. What that means is that a lot of the ways that Jesus presents himself as replacing the festivals and the signs of Israel. So in chapters 7 through 9, Jesus is the replacement of the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. When he says, I'm the light of the world and I'm the living water, those two things, light and water, were symbols of this feast, this particular Feast of Tabernacles. He also is the replacement for the Passover. We see that in chapter 19, also earlier in chapters 5 and 6. And in the Passover, Jesus dies on the Passover, and some of the language used in Jesus' crucifixion narrative, for instance, that no bone in his body was broken, that's what also had to happen with the Passover lamb, that no bone in its body could be broken. So Jesus replaces feasts and also signs for Israel. Jesus is the prophet of God. He does signs and wonders that authenticate who he is, and he also is the temple. If you go and look at John chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. It's this great passage where Jesus goes in the temple and he sees, this situation where people are doing things in the temple they shouldn't be doing, which is basically robbing people. These temple leaders were taking advantage of people coming to the temple for sacrifice, and Jesus gets angry and overturns the tables. And at the end of that, as he's being threatened with arrest and all this, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." And the Pharisees and scribes are like, "What are you talking about?" And John inserts this little phrase, and he says, "They did not understand that he was speaking about his body." In other words, the Gospel of John presents Jesus as the temple of God. In other words, he is where God dwells on earth with mankind. In the Old Testament, the building called the temple was where God dwelt with his people Israel. Now Jesus is here in his body, him being incarnate, made flesh. That's the temple. That's where God dwells with his people, is in the person of Jesus. And so Jesus replaces the temple. Secondly, another theme in John that's not found in the other synoptic gospels is the I am statements, and you should be able to list these on a midterm. I've listed them for you here. I'm not going to walk through each of these, but in each of these situations, Jesus says what he is. So I am the bread of life. In other words, I am where you receive sustenance. I am where you receive life. I am how you are to be fed. I am the light of the world. I'm how you see truth and how you see God. I am the door. I'm the way that people get to the Father. I'm the good shepherd. I'm the one who cares for God's people. I'm the resurrection and the life. I am how one is taken from death to life, how somebody is raised from the dead. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the way to the Father. If you want to know God the Father, you have to know God the Son. And finally, I am the true vine. This true vine language is talking about the fact that Jesus is, again, sort of like the bread of life. He's the life-giving source. He is where we dwell with God and how we dwell with God and how we're sustained by God. So the I am statements, and again, you ought to be able to list those. The third really key theme that, again, we see this in the Synoptics. We especially saw it with Luke, but we see it even more so with John, is Jesus' missionary task. Jesus talks all the time about how he's sent by the Father to do certain things. So you see all the scriptures listed there. As you read through John, I'm sure you'll see those and recognize those. I would encourage you to look them up individually. But he is sent by the Father to do a particular task. And so that's why I have here under letter B, the incarnation is a missionary operation. God sends Jesus into the world. God, as Jesus, comes into the world to accomplish something. And as we've talked about so far, he comes into the world to accomplish the task of restoring the world through restoring Israel. He has come to be what all the Old Testament expects, to restore Israel and thereby restore the world, to defeat evil, to forgive sins, to redeem creation. That's why he's here. And the Gospel of John really picks up on that Jesus has a missionary task to perform. Fourthly, again, the other three Gospels don't have this. John includes the messianic signs. And again, like the I am statements, there are 7 of these messianic signs. I list them for you here. You should be able to list them on a midterm. So he turns water into wine at Cana. He heals an official's son. He also then heals an invalid. He feeds the multitude. He heals a man born blind. And then climactically, he raises someone else from the dead. And then he himself is raised from the dead in John chapter 20. There are a couple of reasons, or a few things we need to say about the signs. First of all, signs are an aid to faith. Signs are something that help us believe. So that when John writes about these things, they're supposed to say, wow, Jesus does these things. Well, who do I believe that he is? They should be an aid to faith, helping us believe the right things about Jesus. But secondly, they're not to be demanded. I hear all the time stuff like, well, if Jesus, or if God would just do this for me, or if God would show me this sign, then I believe, or whatever. But Jesus explicitly says that's not how you're supposed to operate. You can go look at John 4:48 for the exact saying. Signs are not to be demanded. And the key point here is that just because you see a sign doesn't mean you're going to believe. I mean, there are all kinds of people that saw all of these things and they didn't believe. This is sort of like the parable of Lazarus and the rich man that we already talked about in this class, where Lazarus or the rich man says to Lazarus, "Please go tell my sons and my brothers," and all that stuff. And Lazarus says, "Look, if you don't believe in the Messiah from the Old Testament, then you're not going to believe if you see somebody rise from the dead." And that's kind of the point here, is if you don't believe what the scriptures say about God, you're not going to believe if it's thrust in front of your face. Which is interesting because at the end of the gospel, Thomas, of course, is doubting and not believing. And then Jesus appears, and when he sees his hands and feet, he does believe. So that's kind of ironic. And then the third thing we want to say about signs is that those who hear and believe are blessed, not those who must see to believe. So again, it's a situation where Thomas, he sees and then he believes. But those who don't see and believe, they're the blessed ones. And that includes everybody from after the apostles died till now. None of us have seen the physical person of Jesus resurrected from the dead standing in front of us. We have to see him through the scriptures. And so John really has this emphasis on signs. And I'll list the 7 of them for you there. The last and most important one, and this is what I would expect you to be able to articulate on an essay, is new creation. New creation is by far the most prominent theme in John's gospel. Of course, John, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and maybe most like Luke, especially wants people to believe from this gospel, from reading this gospel. So John 20, at the end of John 20, John, the author, writes, Jesus did many other things, and I write these things down so that you might believe. So the purpose of John's gospel is, of course, belief, that we would believe who Jesus is. But one of the key presentations, the main theme that John uses to describe who Jesus is and what he does, is this theme of new creation. So there's 4 ways that I list here that we can see new creation. And you should be able to talk about each of these 4 things on your midterm and use specific verse and chapter and verse references. So first of all, in John chapter 1, John 1:1 begins with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things were made by Him," etc. And so John starts his gospel out by alluding to Genesis 1:1. "In the beginning God made the heavens and the earth." Well, now John 1:1 is saying, well, is the Word, specifically God through the Word, made the heavens and the earth. And so he starts off his gospel by saying, this Word, this logos, is what the Greek is there. This Word is the one who is here right now. John 1:14, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." That Word that made everything in Genesis 1 is now here in the flesh on the earth. John 1 also quotes Isaiah 40 quite a bit, and Isaiah 40 won't go into this in detail, but I just want you to know that Isaiah 40 is a chapter in the Old Testament that is the beginning of a section of Isaiah that's all about new creation, the hope of Israel, that God will come and restore the earth, restore Israel, restore all of creation. And so John is quoting Genesis 1, the original creation, and then also alluding to Isaiah 40, which hopes for the new creation, to present this picture that Jesus is coming. The reason Jesus is here is to renew and restore, to bring about a new creation for the entire world. The second way that John talks about new creation is in those 7 messianic signs that we discussed a couple of slides ago. In those 7 signs, what Jesus does is make something new. He turns the water into wine. He heals an invalid, an official's son, and a man born blind. He renews them. He restores them. He feeds the 5,000, which is related to renewing Israel. Just as God fed Israel in the desert, now Jesus is feeding those that are listening to him. And most importantly, of course, are the last 2, that he raises Lazarus from the dead, and then, of course, that he himself is raised from the dead. So these messianic signs present us with new creation. What is dead and old it is made new. So the 7 signs present us with new creation. And then John chapter 20. If you go and read John chapter 20, and I really encourage you to just press pause here and go read that. John chapter 20 is the story of the resurrection. And in that story, the way John presents it is that, in fact, we could start with John 18, which is where Jesus is praying in Gethsemane. That John... this is just so amazing when you think about it. John 18, Jesus is praying in this garden. He's in a garden setting. He's arrested. He's given a crown of thorns, like Adam's curse that he was supposed to take on. That when he tried to cultivate and keep the earth, he would only get thorns and thistles from it. So Jesus prays in this Garden of Gethsemane about the agony of the cross. He's then arrested, place a crown of thorns on his head, and then as he's dying on the cross, the last thing he says is, "It is finished." It's just this amazing picture of God sort of recreating and restoring the world through Jesus' suffering. But it becomes even more explicit as we get into John chapter 20, because in John 20, the resurrection story is told in a garden setting again. They're in this garden area. It's just Jesus, the new man, the man that's risen from the dead, the newly created man. It's the first day of the week, it says there. And then you have a woman, Mary, who calls Jesus the gardener. So you have a man and a woman in a garden. This man is this new man, Christ, the man Christ, the new man Christ, who has resurrected from the dead. He's newly created. They're in a garden together. And the first thing Jesus does is the 4th part, which is John 21. He goes into the upper room to see his disciples. And what he does when he's there is in John 21, he breathes the Spirit into them, the Holy Spirit of God. And as he's breathing that Spirit into them, John appears to be quoting from Genesis 2:7, where God breathes life into the dust of Adam. And so as Jesus breathes into his disciples, it's paralleled with God breathing life into Adam. And so what happens is in the beginning with John 1, the middle with the signs, and the end with John 20 and 21. And by the way, sorry, this should be John 20, 21, and 22. Beginning, middle, and end, John is presenting Jesus as this ushering in of new creation, as the new creation himself, the new man, the resurrected man. That's a very important theme in John. And so what we've done is we've moved from Jesus being the new Moses in Matthew, and Moses is the one who ushers, who restores the nation of Israel, to the new Exodus situation where Israel is taken out of bondage and given freedom, to the new David and the new Elijah, the new prophet and the new king and prophet of God, where Jesus is this kingly ruler and also this prophet who speaks truth against God's enemies. And now we're into John, and really this is sort of the full-orbed message of the four Gospels, that Jesus comes to restore Israel and thereby to restore the entire world, the entire universe. That's what Jesus is doing, and John makes this very explicit through quoting Genesis 1, through the 7 signs, and through this garden imagery in John chapter 20. Okay, so very important for you to understand how Jesus brings new creation, and how the different ways in John's gospel that's presented. Another key thing for you to understand about John is his purpose. He says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So John's purpose is very clear, that he wants you to believe. And as you read through the Gospel of John, you have to keep that purpose in mind, that John wants you to have a response, that you might believe, and by believing have life in his name. That's what John wants. So remember that purpose statement. A couple of other things about John's Gospel. First of all, I want you to know, and really this is the main thing that I want to mention here towards the end. John's Gospel is split into 2 parts. The first part is called the Book of Signs. And if you look back at the references to that slide on the 7 signs in John, you'll see that they all occur basically here in this Book of Signs. The only one that doesn't occur within chapters 1 through 12 is Jesus' resurrection, the very last sign. And so that's why it's called the Book of Signs, because this is where Jesus performs all of those 6 of the 7 signs. Notice that most of this right here, especially, so chapters 2 through 10, is taken up with Jesus replacing Judaism. And then in chapter 11, we begin to foreshadow the death and resurrection of Jesus. The second half of the book is called the Book of Glory. And this is where Jesus begins, like in Luke with the travel narrative, like in Mark with his long discourse about the cross. This is where Jesus begins to look forward to his upcoming death and talk about it and prepare his disciples for it. So they take the Passover meal together. They take the Lord's Supper for the first time together. And then you need to know that John, I don't know why I don't have references here, but John 14 through 17. So John 14 through 17 is known as the farewell discourse. You need to know that term, just like you need to know the terms Book of Signs, Book of Glory. And the farewell discourse is the place where Jesus talks about, I'm going to prepare a place for you. I'm the vine, you're the branches. Abide in me, and I'll abide in you. He who loves me keeps my commandments. All these sorts of things, and then he prays in John 17 for his disciples. And this is right before he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is him prepping his disciples for life without him. He talks about sending the Holy Spirit, who's called the Paraclete, the Advocate, or the Helper. But it's called the farewell discourse because he's basically saying goodbye to his disciples. He's preparing them for what's about to happen. And then, of course, we have the Passion, where Jesus is arrested, stands trial, dies and rises again, resurrection, and then the conclusion and epilogue to the gospel. Of course, there's so much that we could talk about in each of these books. But this is just intended to give you sort of an overall glance at what's going on in these New Testament books. It's a survey. So if you have questions about any of these sections, if you want to talk about what's going on with the epilogue, where Jesus goes fishing with his disciples after his resurrection, if you want to talk about anything about death and resurrection, if there's anything you ever have a question about that I don't mention in here, please feel free to ask. But we have limited amount of time to go through the entire New Testament, and so some of this is going to be rather cursory. If you have questions, let me know. I believe we have a quiz on Tuesday, so make sure you prep for that, and I will see you then.